Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom by Professor Norman G. Finkelstein. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Part 4A of 4C. Conclusion. A 2012 UN report posed the poignant question, will Gaza be a livable place in 2020? Its response, based on current trends, was just barely, while it would require Herculean efforts to reverse these trends. The prognosis appeared yet bleaker a few years later. 3 Israeli military operations in the past 6 years, in addition to 8 years of economic blockade. A 2015 United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, report found, have ravaged the already debilitated infrastructure of Gaza, shattered its productive base, left no time for meaningful reconstruction or economic recovery, and impoverished the Palestinian population in Gaza. At the time of writing, some 50% of Gaza's population is unemployed, while 70% is food insecure and dependent on humanitarian aid. 70% of the nearly 20,000 homes destroyed during Protective Edge have still not been rebuilt. 70% of Gazans have piped water supplies for only 6 to 8 hours every 2 to 4 days, while nearly all Gazans suffer from power outages lasting 16 to 18 hours each day. For the first time in a half-century, a team of health researchers found, mortality rates have increased among Palestine refugee newborns in Gaza. In answer to the question posed by the 2012 UN report, the 2015 UNCTAD report forecast that on the present trajectory, Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. It's possible that this projection, which gave Gaza a 5-year window of opportunity, was too sanguine. Another war with Gaza was inevitable, senior Israeli officials ominously observed in 2016. We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition. Therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict. The proximate cause of Gaza's desperate plight is the siege. The 2015 UNCTAD report observed that the complete and immediate lifting of Israel's blockade is more urgent than ever if Gaza is to have a chance to avoid further damage and develop into a livable place. In a follow-up report a year later, UNCTAD again sounded the alarm. The population of Gaza is locked in, denied access to the West Bank and the rest of the world. Even people in need of medical treatment are not allowed to travel to obtain essential health care. Full recovery of the Gaza Strip is challenging without a lifting of the blockade, which collectively negatively affects the entire 1.8 million population of Gaza and deprives them of their economic, civil, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to development. The siege, which constitutes a form of collective punishment, is a flagrant violation of international law. The UN Human Rights Council report on Operation Protective Edge, although a whitewash and a sham, nonetheless called on Israel to lift the blockade immediately and unconditionally. Israel's severe restrictions on exports from the Gaza Strip, Sarah Roy of Harvard University concluded, have little or anything to do with security. Their purpose clearly is to maintain the separation of Gaza and the West Bank. Its severe travel restrictions, according to Gisha, the Israeli Legal Center for Freedom of Movement, result more from Israel's minimalist approach to its obligations toward the 1.8 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip than from its obligation to protect the security of Israeli citizens. The benefits to Israeli security are hard to identify. Even Israel's prestigious newspaper Haaretz scoffed at the notion that the blockade provided security and called for it to be lifted. There is no justification for the closure of Gaza. It hasn't prevented missiles from being fired at Israel. It hasn't caused the hoped-for public uprising against the Hamas government. and it constitutes an incubator for the development of despair and cycles of violence that have made the lives of residents of southern Israel intolerable. The Israeli government must immediately end its blockade of Gaza. This Palestinian ghetto must be opened. In all likelihood, the lethal trends prefiguring Gaza's exhaustion as a viable habitat won't be checked. The political muscle needed to reverse Israeli policy vis-a-vis Gaza is sorely lacking. In the newly emerging constellation of regional and global political alignments, Israel's star is waxing, as it has made significant diplomatic inroads among key state actors. Meanwhile, Palestine's star is on the wane. Whereas it benefited from a unique salience on the world stage this past half-century, the cause of Palestine has now been eclipsed by the numberless humanitarian crises racking the Middle East. Even if and when the dust settles, it's improbable that Palestine will regain its former moral resonance. Inexorably, it will be reduced to the minuscule geopolitical weight of its demography and territory, and come more closely to resemble the self-determination struggles in East Timor and Western Sahara. If it was an uphill battle before, the path henceforth will be immeasurably steeper. A cascade of recent developments impinging on Gaza flesh out this forbidding picture. At worst, regional players, such as Egypt, turn the screws on Gaza tighter than even Israel would counsel. At best, regional players, such as Saudi Arabia, try to score points with Arab public opinion and purchase local patronage by earmarking aid packages, in the event, mostly unfulfilled, for Gaza. None of the regional powers, however, is about to expend political capital on Gaza's behalf. On the contrary, both Egypt and Saudi Arabia are forging a long-term strategic alliance with Israel. After the Mavi-Marmara incident, Turkey conditioned a resumption of normal relations with Israel on an end to the blockade. But in 2016, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan capitulated. He re-established diplomatic ties after derisory Israeli concessions enabling him to save face. In the meantime, the Middle East Quartet, the US, EU, UN, and Russia, issued in 2016 a long-awaited statement on the peace process. It pinned primary culpability for the deterioration in Israeli-Gazan relations on the illicit arms buildup and militant activity by Hamas, and it determined that preventing the use of territory for attacks against Israel is a key commitment that is essential for long-term peace and security. Its only direct mention of the horror that unfolded during Protective Edge read, in the course of the 2014 conflict, Israel discovered 14 tunnels penetrating its territory. The report did acknowledge in passing that the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza was exacerbated by the closures of the crossings, and that Israeli restrictions on external trade and access to fishing waters contribute to food insecurity and humanitarian aid dependency. But the quartet called on Israel not to end but only to accelerate the lifting of movement and access restrictions to and from Gaza, and then interpolated the escape clause that due consideration should be given to Israel's need to protect its citizens from terrorist attacks. Thus, so long as Israel purports that sealing off Gaza from the outside world is necessary to protect itself from Hamas terrorism, or, in other words, until and unless Gaza surrenders its fate to Israel, the siege will continue with the quartet's blessing. Of the complementary international reconstruction plans for Gaza, Roy observes, they read more like security plans, carefully laying out Israeli concerns and the ways in which the United Nations will accommodate them. Israel must approve all projects and their locations, and will be able to veto any aspect of the process on security grounds. Not only will the blockade of Gaza be maintained, but responsibility for maintaining it will in effect be transferred to the UN, which is tasked with monitoring the entire process of which Israel retains full control. True, after a visit to Gaza in 2016, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon told a news conference, "The closure of Gaza suffocates its people, stifles its economy, and impedes reconstruction efforts. It is a collective punishment for which there must be accountability." Alas, he only reached this epiphany 6 months before the end of his 10-year term of office. In the instant case, late was not better than never, it was never. Gaza has not yet crossed the threshold of no return. To be sure, one would have to be blinder than King Lear to believe that diplomatic negotiations in and of themselves might yet yield fruit. When the current phase of the peace process was inaugurated in 1993, 250,000 illegal Jewish settlers resided in the occupied Palestinian territory. By 2016, 600,000 settlers resided in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The bitter fruit it yielded in Gaza requires no further comment. If the essence of a phenomenon is to be grasped not in its packaging but in its content, then Palestine has borne witness not to a peace process but to an annexation cum despoliation process. The Quartet report called for the resumption of meaningful negotiations. But it isn't possible to resume what never began. Still, it is no more likely that Hamas's strategy of armed resistance can achieve substantive results. However legally and morally defensible, firing bottle rockets at one of the world's most formidable military powers will not bring it to its knees. It merely provides Israel with a convenient alibi when it periodically decides, in pursuit of objectives wholly divorced from these rockets, to annihilate Gaza. A strategy of mass nonviolent resistance, by contrast, might yet turn the tide. Gaza's richest resources are its people, the truth, and public opinion. Time and again, and come what may, the people of Gaza have evinced a granite will, born of a sheer indomitable dignity. UNRWA spokesperson Chris Gunness, not to be held in bondage. Protective edge battered that will but, it appears, did not yet shatter it. Truth is on the side of Gaza. If this book rises to a crescendo of anger and indignation, it's because the endless lies about Gaza by those who know better cause one's innards to writhe. Gandhi called his doctrine of nonviolent satyagraha, which he translated as, "hold on to the truth." If the people of Gaza, in their multitudes, hold on to the truth, it's possible, which is not to say probable, let alone certain, just possible, and not without immense personal sacrifice, up to and including death, that Israel can be forced to lift the suffocating blockade. What iron dome or what tunnel detection system can stop them? An Israeli observer rhetorically asked. If one day a few tens of thousands, or maybe a few hundreds of thousands, decide to climb the fence, or hold a hunger strike next to it. The cause of Palestine still inspires and can draw from huge reserves of international public support, including in recent years wide swaths of Jewish opinion estranged from Israel's lurch rightward and leap into the moral abyss. At the core of this mass of sympathetic opinion stands an international solidarity movement ready, willing, and able, when the moment of reckoning is upon it, to give its all for Gaza. If the people of Gaza, on the one hand, and global public opinion, on the other, are mobilized, galvanized, and organized, and if a cause guided by truth, fortified by law, animated by righteousness, and bending toward justice can unleash, as history is testament, an irresistible moral power able to defeat, disarm, and diffuse brute force, then a small miracle might yet come to pass. The people of Gaza will be able, at least, at last, to breathe again and ultimately, if we all, persevere, to end the occupation. In A Century of Dishonor, written at the end of the 19th century, Helen Hunt Jackson chronicled the destruction of the Native American population by conscious, willful government policy. The book was largely ignored, then forgotten, and finally rediscovered by later generations ready to hear and bear the truth. Speaking to the fate of the Cherokee Nation, which was expelled from one tribal homeland after another and finally stripped of its tribal holdings by the U.S. government, Jackson wrote, "There is no record so black as the record of its perfidy to this nation." The present volume was modeled after her searing requiem. The author holds out faint hope that it will find an audience among his contemporaries. Still, the truth should be preserved. It is the least that's owed the victims. Perhaps one day in the remote future, when the tenor of the times is more receptive, someone will stumble across this book collecting dust on a library shelf, blow off the cobwebs, and be stung by outrage at the lot of a people, if not forsaken by God then betrayed by the cupidity and corruption, careerism and cynicism, cravenness and cowardice of mortal man. There will come a time, Jackson anticipated, when, to the student of American history, it will seem well-nigh incredible what was done to the Cherokee. Is it not certain that one day the black record of Gaza's martyrdom will in retrospect also seem well-nigh incredible?